Welcome, everybody, to the Hedgehog Noon Discussion. I'm Jay Tolson, editor of the Hedgehog Review here at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. Today, two things. We celebrate the launch of our new issue, which is titled Missing Character, with 8 essays on that theme, as well as the other offerings of a typical issue. This one, as I introduce it from the editor's comment at the beginning, in part by saying, there is little need to say that we live in fraught times, nationally and globally, or to enumerate all the challenges we face. We feel the pervasive precariousness like static in the air before a thunderstorm. Yet if forced to choose the one thing that matters most in this gathering gloom, I would not settle on any of the challenges themselves. I would point instead to the question of character, of whether we, the people, will be able to muster or even recognize the kind of moral courage needed to face those challenges. That kind of courage entails, among other things, real honesty and a humble regard for truth, a willingness to sacrifice for others, and the resilience that comes from faith in higher goods. Such courage is character in a sense that cannot be dismissed as merely parochial or privileged. And it is the deficit of character in that sense that motivates the thematic focus of this issue of the Hedgehog Review. Our various pieces range from James Davis and Hunter's piece on the denial of the moral as lived experience, which focuses on the shallowing of our vocabulary, our moral vocabulary. We have other pieces on the current popularity of ancient thinkers and what we should really learn from antiquity in terms of the questions of moral formation and character. We have a piece on the character of tragedy, another on the coddling of the American undergraduate, and the basis of everything, the fragility of character in a truth-challenged world. We also have a piece on vocation and moral imagination, and the necessity of networks, the case of William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect. So it's a pretty wide-ranging set of essays, all addressing this question. And I hope that you will pick up a copy of it if you haven't received one already. This is also the first issue in our 25th anniversary year of the Hedgehog Review. So it marks a symbolic occasion as well as just a regular event. And I'd also like to point out that our moderator today, Kyle Williams, the senior editor here, is a historian of some note and the author of the new book, recently arrived and already widely reviewed, titled Taming the Octopus, The Long Battle for the Soul of the Corporation. And I commend it to you heartily. Kyle, take over if you would, please. And
yeah, thank you, Jay. And thank you all for being here. It's good to see so many new and familiar faces. And I just wanted to kick off our discussion with a bit of an intro about what our topic is and to introduce our guests. And our topic today is personality, the rise of a curious fascination by, maybe you could even describe it as a devotion to, and an investigation of the self with the tools of psychology and the conceptual language of personality. This is an ethical and philosophical question, but it's also a historical one. How did personality become something that we care so deeply about? How did it become such an important concept for understanding ourselves and how we relate to those around us? Those are some of the questions that we'll be taking up a little bit today and other ones. The cultural historian Warren Sussman wrote keenly about the ways in which personality came to replace character as a cultural ideal beginning in the late 19th century. We might explain this transformation in terms of how self-expression and authenticity seem to matter more than self-sacrifice, or how the so-called leisure ethic seemed to fit much better in a consumer society than the old Protestant work ethic. But this question of personality, it's not simply a story about moral decline or the rise of decadence. The old ideals of character and citizenship and duty and so forth, of course, did not simply disappear. They persisted in different ways into contemporary society. What we're trying to get at, rather, is a cultural story about how we make meaning and how we come to understand the human self. And in this sense, Warren Sussman discovered a monumental shift in the early 20th century when there arose a growing interest and I'm quoting him, in personality, individual idiosyncrasies, personal needs, and interests. The vision of self-sacrifice began to yield to that of self-realization. Warren Sussman's an important scholar of this transformation. There's other ones that could be thrown into the mix. Philip Rieff traced what he famously called the triumph of the therapeutic. Charles Taylor theorized about expressive individualism. Our own Institute's fellow Jackson Lears investigated how the longing for rebirth and interior renewal fueled consumer desire. So from different angles, we can see how the primary frame of meaning and meaning making for many people turned inward to interior experiences and discoveries and malleable identities. This turn inward was often quite self-reflexive. And in fact, it was enabled by the development of fields of psychology and the language of personality to make sense of our interior lives. And that's the topic of the essay that we're going to be talking about today. It's a great essay, and I'm going to post it in the chat when I'm done talking, a link to it in the chat so you can read it yourself if you haven't yet. It's an important contribution to the cultural and intellectual history of personality and personality testing, and it's called Sorting the Self, Assessment, and the Cult of Personality. It's by Christopher Yates, who's our guest today. Chris teaches philosophy at James Madison University and is a research fellow and at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture here at the University of Virginia. He specializes in 19th and 20th century European philosophy and aesthetics. His scholarly work concentrates primarily on phenomenology and hermeneutic traditions, the period of German idealism and the intersections of these with currents in the visual and literary arts. He is the author of The Poetic Imagination in Heidegger and Schelling, as well as scholarly articles on topics such as ontology, ethics, poetics, existentialism, and he's written quite searchingly about writers like Cormac McCarthy and Walker Percy and the director Terrence Malick. And he's currently working on a book on the function of imagination and longing in the practice of reason. So with that, I want to pitch it over to Chris. Chris, thank you so much for joining us today. And just to kick us off, I'll ask just a general question about how did you get interested in this topic? What drew you to it? And maybe you could give us a little bit of an overview.
Certainly. Well, thank you, Kyle, and thanks for your hard work in helping me get this piece into presentable form. Thanks everyone for being here. I look forward to your thoughts. I think probably like many of us, I was critically curious about this incredible sort of phenomenon of popularity among various personality assessment instruments used in different sectors of our society. One day when I was teaching in one of my undergraduate courses, we were talking about issues of subjectivity, issues of selfhood, and personality tests came up and had an interesting discussion. And I realized that nearly all of them had been tested for their personalities and their talents, reducing sort of collecting a sense of their traits. This was a part of education. This was a part of their career preparation. And it was the air they were breathing. And I found that strange, but enticing, something to look into. So I thought, well, here we have a phenomenon that might reflect something deeper about the experience of the self today, and how we're fascinated with the self, but also confused about the self. So I began looking into it. I wanted to know the premises behind this practice of what's called psychometrics. And the more I pursued that, the more I snooped around, the more complex I realized it was, and the more pervasive it was, not just in psychology practices, therapeutic practices, but also in the business world. I hope some of you today are coming from that. And in the world of spiritual formation practices, and also just sort of a rudimentary kind of sporting interest in it among people. So I started to look into its history as best I could. It's a huge history, but the story I found, how to put it in summary terms, what I noticed was just a sort of what I call in the piece a slippage between presuming to give an account of a person in what comes to be a trait-based way, and then sort of declaring that this is who the person is. So it's a slippage between sort of how they present and who they are, and how this term personality comes to represent something almost new in history, a summary account of who a person is. So the movement of the testing practices was fascinating. And it gained this incredible momentum, especially in the 20th century. And what I noticed was that maybe it had effectiveness in its practices, but the core premise behind it was, if we can codify the individual in an empiricist way, we'll know what to do with them. We'll know who they are, whether it's in psychiatry, psychology, or whether it's in the manufacturing industry, and onwards, or whether it's in simple aptitudinal testing. But the movement to codify, as so often happens in sort of empiricist practices in our culture, it takes on an allure. And I wanted to tell the story of how that allure was so beguiling that, ironically, these psychometric practices, while serving some utilitarian ends and maybe doing some good, but actually ended up putting us at a greater distance from the self. And so then in the piece, I sort of teased that through larger reflections on the nature of the modern or late modern self, to sort of arrive at a sense of, okay, how does this phenomenon reveal the deeper issue of what Walker Percy calls the malaise of the self, right, in the world. And so I found that it did. I found that it did, and that this practice has become quite pervasive, but losing the ability to be self-critical, not to make a pun, but losing the ability to sort of ask itself, behind the sheen of positivism, what might we be missing, right? We've gotten so good at saying what you are, but to what extent have we lost the ability to ask who you are? So the movement towards a sort of, this is where, if you've read the piece, you can see I'm quite critical. The movement towards a spreadsheet version of the self, as opposed to the version of the self that is found in a conversation. I think that's probably a good synopsis for now, Kyle. We can see where we go. Yeah.
That's a good way to get us started. Yeah, there's a lot there that I already want to ask you about and respond to, but for those of us who haven't read the piece, or perhaps for those who would benefit from some recall, I was hoping to sort of walk through some elements of the piece first, and part of the as an intellectual historian myself, someone who's interested in ideas, and not ideas in the abstract, but just sort of how ideas are made and how they're developed into organizations and technologies, and how they're deployed, as you might put it, is really interesting to me. And I was very much taken in the piece with the intellectual history you describe about personality assessments. Remember, in editing the piece, you told me that people don't call them tests; they call them instruments or assessments. So I want to get the terminology right. But I was wondering if you could, you don't have to get into all of the details, but could you tell us in short some of that story from the early 20th century? And I'm going to quote from you really briefly here. You said that, born from an aptitudinal lineage, then elevated to a psychological enterprise with irresistible commercial applications. personality theory passed from its axial age into a fixation without ever really pausing to rethink its leap of faith from the conditional and the speculative to the declarative and determinative. And so I guess the question that I want to pose to you is how would you tell the story about how personality theory became a fixation in the United States by the mid 20th century?
Yeah. It's not so easy to discern as you might think. I'm not a historian, but I probed it more than I expected to. And I can just share what I found, and we'll see if others want to contribute to this as well. But of course, historically, there was aptitudinal ways of thinking about people going back many centuries. So a sense of, as culture is organized into institutional arrangements, political arrangements, commercial arrangements, there was an aptitudinal impulse to figure out what today we would call who are the right personnel for what jobs. And this coming late 19th century, you saw this developing in civil service environments in Britain and then in the US. I guess I would say around the time of the First World War is where something interesting happened. An attempt to sort of mobilize personnel. It became important to test servicemen for their ability to endure, especially things like trauma on the battlefield. And so it wasn't just assessing aptitude, it was assessing a sort of psychological fitness. And those who know this history know the Wordworth personal data sheet was used. Well, it really became popular after World War I, but that's when it was introduced. And so so you have a kind of military movement, the aptitudinal focus and assessing who a person is, what will they be good at, becomes what can they endure, what can they put up with. And this all makes good sense, right? But you start to get a testing mechanism in place, and it secures itself in military and government contexts. Now, at the same time, it's sort of a Venn diagram here. Around 1879, 1880, you have Wilhelm Wundt in Germany conducting lab experiments to sort of assess positivistically the nature of people's psychology. And the drift, so some of the story is a drift from, it's sort of like an arms race for understanding the human being, the Germans and then the Americans. And so you have a lot of these approaches coming into America through people like Gordon Allport, James McKean Cattell. You have in 1921, you have this idea of the individual differences movement, focusing on trait analysis. And so it's advancing in psychology. There's an attempt to sort of say, okay, we have a behavioralist approach and we have a humanist approach. How can we draw them together? But what I did not expect to find, and what makes sense is that 1915, 1917, you have a commercial overlap. As the industrial age is well on its way, right? Manufacturing sectors are starting to get created. You have people like Hugo Munstenberg and Walter Dill who bring the tools of the psychological into dealing with workforces. So that it doesn't take long before you have almost like what today we would call consulting agencies trying to help arrange labor forces on the basis of worker traits. You can't quite pay them more, but you can coordinate them better and make them feel better placed.
So it's a kind of project of efficiency then, human resources and that kind of thing.
Which is a perfect phrase. We use the phrase human resources without batting an eye today, but this is a part of its history. To see a human being as a resource, and maybe this is well intended, and maybe some good came of it, but it's certainly a utilitarian sort of driven, profit-driven, worker morale-driven thing. And so, as far as I could tell, like by the 1940s, by the 1950s, it's a three-circled Venn diagram, right? Of course, there's testing for aptitude, but already in testing for aptitude, you're presuming to define a person. Okay. But you also have the psychological testing overlaid with that. And then you have the commercial, right? This, as far as I can tell, it proves to be irresistible because it has this spell of we can decipher the person in many contexts, and then we can decide what to do with them, whether it's treatment or human resources, or so on. And, you know, and in the 1950s, I think this is pretty well secured. And so it's astonishing the number of testing instruments you come across that were used in this history. It's incredible. And not just the testing instruments that are used, but then the ways to test the testing instruments, right? And this is where I found Jerry Wiggins' work, looking back on this, with a very earnest concern to say, look, we're working under the name of objectivity, but how do we know that our mechanisms of objectivity are objective? And I just think that was incredibly telling. And that aspect of self-criticism falls behind as the enthusiasm for psychometrics becomes more widespread and more popular. So that where we are today is that this is big business. This is big business. I have to generalize a bit, but I know it's diversely applied, but it has a pervasiveness in which I think a questioning of its premises and the sort of alleged empiricism behind it is on the wane, to put it mildly.
Yeah, that's really great. Thanks for telling that history. It seems that part of this history that you're telling in the piece and your discussion here is about well, there are many instances in modern life of instruments and tests and technology that we come to think can really genuinely reveal and manifest something that's hidden in the human person. I mean, I think especially of the polygraph test, the lie detector, the idea that you could really find out if someone's lying. And it seems like personality instruments fit into that kind of lineage, and I'm not casting aspersions on all of them, but there's a similar trajectory, perhaps you could trace of projects of mastery and disclosure and revelation of something that's a lot more perhaps complicated than we might think when you're really trying to manage a big organization, whether it's a military or a corporation, and trying to fit people into more efficient arrangements of coordination, right? And I guess that's one of the slippages that I wanted to ask you about. And also, before I ask you the question, I wanted to remind everybody who's on the call that you should be thinking about your own questions. We'll be opening up the Q&A in a few minutes. And so you could prepare those and raise your digital Zoom hand, and we'll get to you soon. But I wanted to ask about how this development of these personality assessments jumped into a kind of characterization of the human person, because it seems to me that's another sort of slippage that you're trying to trace here. And you talk about in the piece that the word person comes from the Latin word persona that originally meant in the older Latin usage, of course, a mask that an actor would wear on a stage that represented something about their character, or perhaps about their role in a production. And in any case, it represented something about their function or their place in society, as it were. And it's focused on outward appearances and representations. But it seems to me that what we're talking about here with a codification or a revelation of personality is something about a person's interior life. And I wonder how you thought about what people mean when they use the word person and what personality. Could you just sort of talk about what's the relationship between person and personality?
I mean, in one sense, there's nothing prima facie wrong with speaking of personality. It serves a great function when we refer to it as how someone carries themselves, their tendencies, their traits. It's not as though some great sin is being committed against the project of selfhood, so it works well enough. But there is some irony in the fact that the lineage of the word has passed through many phases. It doesn't really become a term of choice till it's popularized early 20th century. So we start with persona and how one represents another character, a performance of another character. Then the term travels through the Renaissance and it travels up to the 19th century, comes to sort of mean two things, comes to mean both the kind of the way someone presents socially as a charismatic creature of some kind, but also it's a legal term, personality, for someone in the possession of some estate. But then once we get to things like the Big Five inventory, Myers-Briggs, any of these other early tests, early mid tests that are formed, I think that what's happened is we trust our ability to identify consistent patterned properties of people. And this is, for me as a philosopher, interesting already. But then, so the outward patterned presentation of people. And so words like extrovert, introvert, fine, helpful, but have their source in Carl Jung's theories for the most part, for example. These things have a history. But when you identify outward properties, the slippage would be to then sort of be treating the person as a thing. And I think personality, although it suggests a kind of dynamic process underway, it really suggests a thing, right? Just as I might read Consumer Reports to study the automobile I want to buy, we're reading people as assemblages of properties. And so that is in some ways fine enough on the outward, the way we display ourselves outward, contextualized in society and the idiosyncrasies of society. But the inward is left with very little say in the matter. And I believe that it's not so much right to say what is this thing that is you, but who are you? What do you care about? What gives you pause? What gives you a sense of fulfillment? We lose the ability to create a space of inward reflection when the so-called thingliness of the human person is objectified according to properties. So confusing the properties with something like an essence. And I think when we go to the inward and a question of who are we, what we used to call sort of maybe who is my interior character, we have to sort of hold it lightly. I don't think the self is built for a conclusive codification of who we're not all incredibly maybe as special as we want to think we are, right? We exhibit certain similarities, but the human person is not a personality, right? And the term, as we know, terms guide thoughts, just like tools guide behavior, tools guide thoughts. And so the usage of this term personality, which is given such default trust and respect, I think it shapes how we think of personhood, and along the way, personhood loses some of its sort of texture.
It sounds like you're describing a sort of intellectual lab leak or something. These tools they're developed in clinical or organizational contexts sort of jump the context in which they were developed, and they become, as you say, they influence the way that we think and the things that we care about, right?
Yeah.
If you have a question, please raise your Zoom hand. Jay Tolson has one. I'll invite you to unmute yourself there, Jay.
Right, just to orient your very helpful history and analysis a little in the direction of character and personality differences. One of the things that strikes me about the personality emphasis and the use of personality assessments is that they strive to get at something deep, like our nature, what we fundamentally are, something that is immutable in some respects. And therefore, one of the implications, at least in therapeutic uses, and in professional, occupational, is that, we somehow have to arrange the environment or the working conditions that and dynamics so that will suit or this type, who is this type by nature determined. Whereas the character ideal, which seems to offer the prospect that we as human beings have a certain amount of freedom and latitude to try to shape ourselves according to certain ideals, principles, visions, hopes, and that the loss of the sense of character, or the primacy of character, or at least the equivalence of character to personality, is one of the things that I think has led to the weakening of character, the character ideal and moral formation in contemporary culture. Obviously, this institute and many of its fellows lean toward a more Aristotelian perspective in many ways, and see formation as something that is aspirational, that we aim for, and that is created largely through our participation in communities that have meanings. And alas, those meanings seem to be on the decline in a lot of our contemporary culture. So personality takes over, and it, again, I think it places the onus on how this sort of innate quality will make us fit in usually some kind of utilitarian context. So, I mean, do you? I assume you see that sort of that almost transformation occurring, Chris.
I think I certainly do. There's still some mystery in it, right? Because we're in the middle of it still. But I see the transformation going from, again, sort of selfhood is a project, right? And so as far as transformations in the history of ideas and the history of social practices, under a character paradigm, there is a sense in which the practice of selfhood is a praxis in the Greek sense of a practice you undertake, where as a aspirationally moral creature before an aspirationally defined creature. Character doesn't just refer to the moral, of course, in someone like Sussman. It refers to understanding oneself contextualized according to larger commitments that are bigger than that self. And this becomes very difficult to do, because the large, as history moves into late modernity, the larger contexts that are be them from community or be from tradition, and sometimes these need to be reformed and revised, but the larger contexts are taken over by commercial institutions, primarily by the era of technological production. So if we're going to be people of character, we lose, and Reef talks about this, we lose the context for doing it. And so to speak of personality might be a start, but the irony we're in and have been in for some time is that we're caught between the premise of individualism on one hand, this sort of you're special, you have agency, activate who you are, discover who you are, reclaim who you are, a kind of territorialism of you, right, is one message. And at the same time, the context in which that is happening is implicitly, sometimes explicitly, telling us to arrange who we are to serve these interests that are not interested in character. They're interested in output, or they're interested in healing, which is great, but healing on the basis of how health is understood in a given contingent situation, in a given contingent discourse. So so there are many profiles in the loss of character, and I don't know that we just want to sort of return to a Victorian kind of view of character, but we just need to admit that a part of the struggle of the self is not that we don't know who we are until our traits are defined. It's that it's that the assumption that we find ourselves on the basis of displaying our individuality is the answer. Individuality, yes, but on the basis of a sort of collaborative moral practice with others, I think is better. I mean, this is the irony, and this is where I'll stop in a moment, but it's ironic that the thing closest to ourselves, the self, is sometimes the hardest thing to know, is it not? Right? And the hardest thing to steward, the hardest thing to direct. And so I think when instead of going to close relationships to help this project, we go to instruments. What we're doing is we are just investing in abstractions. In the right hands, an instrument might be used well, but it's the illusion of solving the problem of the self that just continues the loss, the displacement of character.
We have a question here from Brandon Swanson that I want to go to, and then we can turn over to Sam Fressler, who's raised his hand. Brandon Swanson is asking you to sort of a more speculative question about what happens when we invest in these instruments in our attempt to understand ourselves. He says, I wonder what impact the existence of these instruments have had on the development of personality and behavior. Would simply knowing that my personality and my quote unquote self will or could be measured and codified in order to be chosen for a job or as a candidate, would that change the personality traits and behaviors I subconsciously or consciously enable? So here's the sort of boomerang effects question. What do you think, Chris? To what degree do you think we're molding ourselves to fit the instruments?
What a fascinating question. Yeah, because when you anticipate the terms on which a definition of yourself is going to come, maybe it sort of begins a momentum of how to behave that way. I think that's maybe what the question is asking. I mean, there might be some relief in finding, okay, yes, I've had a hunch that I display these traits and I have these tendencies, and there are pros and cons, or what a lot of the instruments call drivers and derailers, or some of them call them that today. And there might be something to that that's helpful, right? And I think an understandable investment, but I think it's in the trepidation. There's a bit of trepidation alongside the anticipation that am I going to be understood, and am I going to like the typology assigned to me? And so if that's the case, you might be inclined to play the persona more, right? Okay, I'm this abbreviational code, or I suspect I am. So I'm either going to want to go all in on that and perform it well, right? Or I'm going to want to mess with it and maintain my originality in the midst of it. So I think if this is answering the question, I do think it can happen that in the reception of a test result or in the anticipation of where it might go, it can shape how we present ourselves to the world. But I think mostly what happens is if there is some sense of ratification, okay, this is who I am, right? And now I'm going to be helped in this way, or appreciated in this way, or developed in this way. If we have a sense of ratification, then we might, then I don't think it lasts. And I think we circle back to a sense of actual dis-ease or detachment with who we are. Kyle, you can help me if I'm getting to the question.
That's interesting. No, I mean, I think you definitely are. I'm fascinated by what you just said there at the end, though, about if we feel ratified by an assessment, that it won't last. Is it that there's something? Why won't it last? There's something false about it, or do you think? Or are you imagining a circumstance in which someone's performing a certain personality in anticipation of a test or an assessment, that's obviously a sort of performance that can't be sustained. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is one of the many things in which I would really like to hear what others think of, but I don't know how sustained a sort of confirmation bias approach might go in terms of performing our personas. I don't know that we all have that amount of energy. Energy. It lapses into confusion rather quickly about, am I an extrovert? Am I an introvert? Am I this type? This type? No, I think what I mean more so is to just to put the focus on how what's happening, whether it's through a very serious context of the use of assessments or just a sort of recreational amusement, kind of context. What's happened is there is an appeal of being schematized, right? And I think that this is much like the appeal of brand loyalty that goes on. I mean, if you think about how we are groomed in our consumer culture to relate to ourselves, it's by and large through brand affinities, right? I don't mean to sound cynical. I just think this is quite obvious. And so what is a personality type except another form of brand identity? How do we live with brand identities? For a while, they don't last. They last, yeah. The duration of them is becoming quicker and quicker. Hence, the aggressiveness of advertising is becoming faster and faster, right? So I think that we set ourselves up for restlessness and disappointment if we focus on the little buzz of I am this on the Enneagram, I am this on the Myers-Briggs, a little buzz, a little sense of gratification for a while. But anyone who's, I think, practiced in self-awareness knows that this is not quite who they are. But do we have the fortitude to resist the illusion of it as an all-encompassing definition of who we are? So I think it's a perfect storm of things. The allure of the ratification fades, and so we go searching for more when we should be searching for close friendships.
Yeah, that's really good, really thought-provoking, and I want to ask you more questions about the relationship between consumer culture and personality types. But I'm glad to see Sam Pressler's on the call, and he's got a question.
Yeah, hey y'all. I'm actually really curious about the kind of shift from maybe the progressive era, World II era, kind of focus on management sciences to I think where we now are is this kind of technology-focused optimization culture, like the cultivation of the best self, even like the algorithmic generation of the self. And I'm curious, Chris, how you thought about that or have thought about in your research in like this current moment where it feels like we're in like pure optimization mode, which feels a level above the kind of pre-internet, pre-AI times.
Thanks, Sam. Yeah. I did talk with, when you say optimization, my thought first goes to sort of the business sector's use of these tests, although there's also a broader atmospherics of optimization of the self today. And I did speak with people in the business world who work in talent development, human resources, and there is a great deal of earnestness in saying we need to develop people's talent, we need to optimize them. But of course, so it's the belief that we can optimize output as a workforce and optimize people. I don't want to suggest that this is some malicious thing. There's an effort to doing that, but what happens there is, I think, a connection to what's happening more broadly with this language of optimization. You're asked to resource your apparent being, right? Which implies you're supposed to sort of approach yourself as a widget, approach yourself as a tool. That we all feel like we are not at home in ourselves and that our talents are not being effectively appreciated in our careers is, I think, common, right, and understandable. But why do we listen to the language of optimization? Because it's tailored to sort of have a sense of a progression, a sense of steps forward, right? And it sells well. So again, like, it's understandable, isn't it, Sam? I mean, I think like, it is very hard to direct one's sense of being today, because to do that, we're having to contend with the many ways in which our being is resourced for other ends. Okay, so it's an existential crisis. But we learn to think, and I'll stop in a minute, but what happens is we learn to think of optimization on the basis of seeing innovation, efficiency, output against the backdrop of benchmarks and best practices. We learn to think of the very idea of self-development and optimization on models coming to us, right? Models that are contingent and not written in stone, right? They're contingent on other goals. So we absorb that paradigm of optimization into ourselves, and I just don't. I don't think it's very humanizing. I want to be a better person. I want all of us to have a chance to be better people, but I don't think a sort of rubric of greater efficiency, greater multitasking, greater output is the way to do that.
It seems that the goal of achieving higher levels of efficiency and optimization, while they may be modeled off of sort of metrics of profit and loss and rationality and efficiency, it seems likely that the way that most people experience it in their work lives, for example, is not primarily oriented towards dollars and cents. It seems to me like people tend to be motivated by the desire for belonging or status or something that's quite a bit more social, right? Don't you think? I mean, how does that fit in?
I do think that. Well, I think you've put your finger on a simple point. We need to just make sure we say is that, yeah, I certainly agree. We are, but it's a little bit like a square peg in a round hole, right? Because these practices of inventories, instruments, assessments have become a part of the human resources regime, right? And in many sectors of the corporate world, what's happening is that sense of looking for belonging is being met by rubrics and schemas and typologies. And I think most people, right, would have at least an intuitive sense that something is off, right? So fine, if you want to assess my skills and talents and allocate me to this part of services, then fine. But let's not pretend that in cultivating me as an employee, you're cultivating me as a person. And I think those lines have blurred.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. Robert Mason is on the call and he has a question.
Yes, hello all. And Christopher, thank you for your article. The historicity of it just took me page after page. It's good to take a thread and pull on it and really see how all this started to engender. So my hat's off to you. Thank you for that. Let's see, I'm a poet, so I think of William Blake when he says, in the age of dearth, bring out the weights and measures, right? Here we are just crawling over these aspects with our designs and our compasses trying to make sense of it. Of course, that's ideal and that's romantic and that's passé, really, almost anymore. I just wanted to be anecdotal and say, I was at my job, research foundation for the State University of New York. And yes, we went through all of this. And, I decided what was remarkable about my profile was I was A, C, D, and a little bit of B. They couldn't catch me. Now, why is that? I don't know. But, I would think that every human being has a bit of all that in them. And let's not forget that the real critical sense of doing any of this psychometrics was to see who was good at what, I still think it's that way. And when you think of teamwork that we've been, charged with following and giving up the self to work in team, uh, I think there is some merit to knowing who's by you, their biases, their predilections, their gifts, so you can get the most out of a working environment. I don't know if that really translates into uh, the angst of a broken self, because I think we're just too far past it. And I think the limitations of this measure is hocus pocus, like some of the people typed. I can enable this thing any way I want. I could be a D, a nefarious, dark, angry D. I could be, an ebullient C, and a so I don't have any answers. I'm just saying that it's beautiful that we delve into this. When I looked at the Myers-Briggs, just in anticipation of this, believe it or not, Myers-Briggs, the first indicator, the first of the four things they measure is energy. How about that? Energy. I don't think they started with energy when they did this in 1919. But anyway, fascinating. And finally, I do take umbrage with these types of things being applied to self-help and to path work, because yeah, there's no way, for me, that I could eat or accept that I am this or I want to be that. The day of demarcation is over. It's both. It's all. It's none, etc. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Robert. Chris, you have thoughts?
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, not many thoughts except to appreciate what you said. How did you put it? The deep angst, dark existential angst, right? And it caused me to realize. I mean, some uses of these tests might be to help that. Probably not in team building exercise in the company office, but there needs to be spaces to allow people to share their existential angst. Do we not? We need those. But I would just say, I think people that craft these tests might come back and say, no, we've designed the tests to correct for bias in the person taking the test, or attempts to sort of trick the test into getting, so fine, attempts to do that. But I think in some ways it's a generational thing. Those of us who are middle-aged, maybe older, probably inclined towards the kind of reluctance you voiced, to say, I don't buy this. This is not going to, let's not kid ourselves. This is not me. This is not anyone. This is just a sort of a speculative report. But I do think younger people lack that hesitation. I think maybe they sense something is off, but they've really been developed to devour these opportunities to gain definition in themselves. And it almost always has either a sense of discover this about yourself so that the world around you can better make you feel good, or discover this about yourselves so that you can know your destiny in the workforce. So I don't think their existential angst is having a chance to lead to a hesitation over being typologized, which is just another interesting consideration.
Before we get too far in this discussion, I wanted to turn people's attention to a companion piece to this essay, which is the deceptogram. And I'm going to put a URL in the chat. Chris, I want you to talk about the deceptogram. First of all, we publish a lot of essays at the Hedgehog Review, and so far, no one but you has proposed a quiz or a test to go along with their essay. And that's what the deceptogram is. It's a kind of assessment or an instrument that gives you certain types. It's got 50 questions. There are 4 types. Actually, I guess there's a 5th. that's sort of the non-type type. What is this? Why did you make this? And what did you learn along the way?
As you all can tell, I'm very serious as someone who's trying to be thoughtful about things. That's one feature of my personality. I also just sort of need to be silly. And so this quiz started as a silly endeavor, and I hope to think it still is. It is a spoof on personality tests, but to make a point, right? It's meant to be satirical, to sort of to reward people who have gone through the essay and want to sort of relax for a bit and take this test, but also to indicate how such tests entail a form of self-deception. That's why I call it the deceptogram. That, as I say in the essay, if you look at the whole history of personality testing as its own personality, the main feature of this personality is self-deception, in the sense that we have told ourselves that tests are authoritative accounts of who the person is, right? And then we tell ourselves that no, they're just tools, we're using them, but really they have an authority over this. So the deceptogram is a way to go all in on that, and state that, well, at least one definitive feature of the human being is self-deception. This is the existentialist philosopher in me coming out. And so let's for fun try to define ourselves on the basis of how we deceive ourselves. And so I sort of tricked the test takers into that, and then you arrive at one of four types, possibly a vague fifth type. One of four types I created with little descriptions of them, and it's sort of, okay, here's the story you're telling yourself about who you are. If you want to continue living by that, then here's how you double down on it. If you want to mitigate that and try to change the story of who you are and deceive yourself less, then here's a healing mechanism for that. So it's a bit of fun. It's a bit of fun, but I guess there is a serious point I'm hoping people will sense in it.
It's you should all take the test. It's got 50 questions. They're fun. They're fun questions. And you can find out maybe a little bit more about yourself. We had a few questions in the chat that I wanted to get to. And one is from Emmeline Lombardo. She asks, I wonder, did you at all look into the history of horoscopes when researching the history of personality assessments? She says she hasn't finished your piece, but she said, it seems to me, though, that horoscopes are older, quote unquote, than many of the older personality tests discussed, but I could be merely misled. It may well be brand image. Do you see any kind of connection between ancient ideas of fate, modern ideas of determinism, and our addiction with being defined by personality schemas? That question reminds me a little bit of what you were saying about younger generations and their sort of somewhat fatalistic attitude towards the workforce. So, but she says, do you see any connection, any kind of connection between ancient ideas of fate, modern ideas of determinism, and our addiction with being defined by personality schemas? Or do you think these are separate strains of thought, so to speak? What do you think, Chris?
Well, first, I did not really look into the horoscope phenomenon. I think I would have been too taxing on readers to also include that, but it would be worth looking into. The closest I came was looking into this business of soul shades, which I suppose is a bit astrologically related. I know that the horoscopes have some ancient precedents, but I also know that they were really more popularized in the oh goodness, late 19th century Europe. Became an obsession. So I'm sorry, I can't really speak to that, but thank you for pointing it out. I should look into it. But there is this other question here of, okay, ancient questions of fatalism or fate, modern questions of determinism. Well, determinism is a helpful word to bring into this. It speaks to an irony we live with, of on one hand wanting to assert our free agency in our lives, but at the same time finding appeal in the suggestion that we are fated to be who we are. So to put a finer edge point on it briefly, we have a territorial entitlement to define our lives. I think this is a part of freedom, the way we practice individualistic freedom today. But at the same time, we like to be selective determinists, right? So the old models of fatalism, such as in the Stoics, would have been, you cannot control the circumstances of your life, you can control your attitude. This, by the way, has become very popular today in sort of the pop psych versions of Stoicism. We want both and still in our own way today. So I think it's sort of a state of contradiction we're in. Why do we want a little hint of determinism in our lives, which is just a suggestion that ultimately our fate is decided for us by larger mechanisms, be they genetic or cause and effect interactions, social behaviorism, God. Why does that appeal to us? Because it is very difficult, tedious, and disappointing to have to bear responsibility for defining who we are in the absence of the reassurances of the character paradigm. But at the same time, we still want to be the electrical charge that spirits our lives forward. We don't want essentialism, but sometimes we do. So I think it just speaks to the confused state we're in, and there are many reasons for that. Horoscopes and various personality tests, I think, for some people have a sporting interest, a phrase I keep using. It's entertaining, it's suggestive, but also tempt us with a path of significance in our identity. Significance because we're cherished by some part of the universe.
Thanks, Emmeline, for that question. It's very thought-provoking. We have a couple of more questions in the chat that I wanted to get to, and then Max Coleman has a question. If you'd like to join the conversation, you can raise your hand or post a question in the chat. But before I get to those questions, there's an interesting comment from Joseph Brown. He says, as a psychologist, it has been distressing to see the wholesale adoption of personality tests by the corporate world, while they, with the exception of Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram, neither have empirical validity, have been found to capture some aspect of human psychology. Their ability to predict behavior is still quite limited. So the notion that they can provide insight into who we are and how we are has real limits. Given that, it is all the more troubling to see that we have shifted from a sense of character to a conception of the person on such shaky ground. Thanks for that comment, Joseph Brown. And then there's two questions here, one from Shelley Lingenfelter. She asks, what is the practical damage done by psychometrics? Is this related to C.S. Lewis's Men Without Chests? And then there's another question from Catherine Carroll. She says, my question is, how is self versus character observed or manifested just in the course of day-to-day life? We live in a blaming and judgmental world, and it seems that self is important to how we traverse this, and character important to how we hold our self together, or vice versa. So there's two questions, one from Shelley about the practical damage done by psychometrics, and is this related to C.S. Lewis's idea of Men Without Chests, and then Catherine Carroll's about self and character manifested in day-to-day life.
Right. Practical damage. From what I mean, I think I've already talked about this a bit, but I think I would say, here's what I've seen in sort of college students is it just creates more confusion. They're tested for their talents, they're tested for their types, they're sort of psychometrically saturated from middle school on, right? And it just creates a sense of disappointment that they're given this catalog identity that predicts their future in the workforce, but it doesn't fit well. They don't feel that it's right, and they don't know how to lament the fact that this doesn't feel right, and then what? So practical damage in that front. I think practical damage too, in terms of just what any taxonomy would do, right, is making someone feel that their significance is prescribed for them by where they fit in a classification scheme. So this is where I would like to hear more from people in clinical psychology, for example, who maybe have been tracking this. It's really just an impression I have. It goes back to that sort of the energizing feature of being feeling ratified, but then also the wear and tear of that when you realize that you have been ratified, but it's more like you've been audited, and it just doesn't fit well. So practical damage, yes, and then also, it won't surprise you to hear me say this, I just think it's an incredible distraction from the human part of our lives, right? It's an incredible waste of time, distraction from conversation, right? If you want to build better teams and you're with your personnel at work, you should have a happy hour. You should not have a day devoted to workshopping personal inventories and discussing them. You should create spaces for human conversations. Happy hour helps. So the practical damage is it actually disincentivizes us from making ourselves committed and vulnerable to other people about who we are, right? It's hard to quantify that, but it's the sense I get. To the question of men without chests, which is a funny illusion. Yeah, I think so. Self versus character. Again, right. Maybe I could put it this way. You know, sometimes people say, let's make it about freedom. All right. Freedom is born of necessity, right? In philosophy, when you study ethics or do moral philosophy, you say these are situations in some of you know this too. These are situations in which the free agent is trying to answer to more responsibility. Okay. So freedom is born of necessity to honor some sort of moral commitment. Freedom is a matter of responsibility. So I say that because I think the character paradigm captures that. The character paradigm, with some pitfalls, right? It at least is premised on the idea that who you are as a self and your intersubjective connections with others and actions in the world is free, but the project of who you are is to sort of live up to your freedom responsibly. And this is not easy to do when the self is pulled in many directions. The self, sorry to confuse the terms, the self paradigm, I would say we could think of it as more of investing in freedom minus the necessity for constraint, minus the sense of the first and best step of freedom is to sort of purpose it towards commitments that are larger than ourselves. I mean, it's not a perfect dichotomy, but I think the personality industry is maybe well intended at times, but ultimately it's trying to promote and profit from investing in freedom minus chests, right? And investing in the self as something each person can allegedly curate at their whim, right? Which isn't good for the person at all. The character dynamic would be investing and acknowledging how we need to be known by people, right? And offered opportunities to invest ourselves in ways that do something more purposeful with our freedom.
Mm-hmm. Heather Ziegler points out that the deceptive grant reminds her of Walker Percy's Lost in the Cosmos, which I think is inappropriate.
1,000 bows to you for that.
Max Coleman, you have a question?
Yes. So I'm just wondering what you think of the role of neuroscience in some of these discussions. So certainly psychology has been kind of dominant field, at least in the American public consciousness. And it seems like over the last decade or two, things have shifted more toward a neuroscientific perspective. And it's something I worry about in my area, which is the sociology of mental health, because often people will say, well, we can see in the brain that such and such is the case, therefore that must be the cause. And so it's a very kind of reductionist way of thinking about things. And so I wonder if you see a kind of analogy between personality tests and these kind of brain scans as a way of thinking about the self, and also maybe even just literally, do you think that brain scans will be a new form of personality test where people will get their, have an MRI done or something, and then we'll say, oh, well, this is the kind of person you are.
Max, thank you. You're probably more qualified to answer this question than I am, but just one quick, just to help me a bit. So in the neuro approach, they're not looking for traits, right? They're looking for causal mechanisms, or are they looking for causal mechanisms?
I would say both.
Both, right? I don't know exactly where that science is going, but you use the word reduction and reductivist approaches, and I would agree, right? Okay, fine. You can see the way the neurochemical situation appears to be a kind of internal fate, causing a person to behave the way they do and have anxieties they have, and so on. But again, what does that really tell us, right? If you're assuming a logic of cause and effect, there just needs to be a built-in restraint to drawing too many conclusions, because what we know about cause and effect reasoning is it's in a constant state of revision, right? So I do think the allure of this sector of the empirical sciences, as expert as it is, the allure will be very difficult to resist, right? Because it's just another instance of trying to give an account of the human being on the basis of abstractions. An MRI, for example, to me, fascinating, helpful, but should not be used to explain who a person is and the longings they have and how that shapes them. We cannot see consciousness, right? I mean, I'm not a scientist, but we still keep running into mystery. So, but mystery is not profitable, right? They're in discourses of truth or in healthcare. So it would not surprise me, Max, if we do land in a place where better and better empirical expertise based on neurochemical cause and effect relationships is touted as the way to define who we are. It might be helpful in some ways, but I think it will be 2 steps backwards yet again. I mean, as someone in higher education, it wouldn't surprise me in the least if we, within 10 years, are getting notices from student affairs as to what the student mental health types are, and training in how to better serve them according to their types. And I just I understand these kinds of impulses, but I think it occludes personhood while purporting to reveal it. Does that seem too cynical to you?
No, I think you're exactly right.
Certainly, I would need to learn more about it, but that's my sense of where the positivism is going.
Yeah, thank you.
John Seal in the chat says neuroscientist Ian McGilchrist has much to say about this. And there's also a follow-up from Kristen Boardman as a follow-up to Max's question, curious about the role of neuroplasticity, which says we can actually change our neural pathways and essentially change our traits and modes of thinking and being.
Yeah. Wow. Neuroplasticity seems quite promising, as far as I can tell. I think this is onto something. People smarter than me have persuaded me of this, but neuroplasticity is not going to is not going to do much to help you give space to thinking about what will give you joy in life, or what will give you meaning in life, what will relieve you of burdens in life. Neuroplasticity, as far as I could tell, it will give you more malleability and can undo bad patterns, right, of the cause and effect neural relationships, but which is fantastic. But It's not going to, it alone is not going to get us a better sense of what it means to be a person, right? It might free us from the grip of personality industry, and it might dispose us to have something to live with more malleability in who we are. But all that would mean is it would be getting us away from, well, it would be the proof against personality typing to some extent. But we would still need to live in ways where we know ourselves and guide ourselves through the company of others, through close relationships that are close friendships, long discussions, all the things that the infrastructures of our society seem to be discouraging today.
We just have a few more minutes. So if you have a question and would like to pose your question, please do so now. There's a comment from Tom Gollier, and who says, I was struck reading this article with how it's not just a question of whether we want to be a person or a character, a what or a who. It seems to me that characters simply don't fit into the objective reality of, say, a modern corporation. He says that characters are actually a problem. Going back to the personality, going back to the discussion of the personality being a mask, we need to put on an appropriate and hopefully agreeable mask, I assume he means, in order to get the job, and we end up needing to internalize that mask at the risk of losing any sense of our character in order to keep or advance in that job. I mean, that seems, it seems like he's getting at the sort of alienation problem quite well with that comment, Chris. And I wonder if the personality assessment regime has sort of raised the expectations of performing certain kinds of masks or characters. I think about the way that people talk a lot about emotional labor these days, and there's a certain kind of personality type that seems to fit much better within certain entrepreneurial cultures, for example, or large corporate cultures. I wonder if there's a sort of Foucauldian kind of analysis you could do about the refinement of personality performances in our world, if it's becoming more and more of a burden. What's your thought on that, Chris?
In our world in general, or in the,
I guess in the professional worlds.
You know, we should be careful to say, well, first, I love the way that was put, the problem of internalizing the masks. Yeah, we absolutely have to wear masks. We do. It's a part of being a human being. We have to play our roles at certain times, and sometimes that's quite relieving, right? In a sense, but that we also that we might in the professional world have to internalize them. That's a different issue, right? That's a problem. I think amazing things happen professionally when people do fit a role. Having to fit a professional role, even to serve profit, is not in itself a terrible thing. And I think this management science can do wonders, right? It can really bring life to people. But to your question, Kyle, like, I think that once we know a type, right? And if that typology, like in some cases today, just to give you an example, you're supposed to display your Myers-Briggs type on your cubicle, right next to your name. It's a way of making human relations with your colleagues more efficient. Okay, fine. But so the concern is that once we see people in what I call in the essay, I call it the abbreviational way. Once we see that, and once that is given to us in the context of we're helping develop your talent. There's even a test called like Talentify, right? That tells you a lot. Once we're doing this to invest in your talent, then the implicit response is a sort of a social contract. You need to develop your talent since we're trying to develop your talent. And so it can plant the seeds of a sort of you need to play your role the way we see you being predisposed to play it. So I worry about the back end use of these things. If the management consultant says, great job, team, everyone played their roles, then that sends the message of you have to keep living up to your role, because after all, your role represents who you are. So we want you to be yourself and perform yourself, be yourself at your best. But I don't know, the self is more complicated. So it could conceivably plant the seeds of failure. Is that speaking to your thought, Kyle?
Yeah, no, that's great. Jay Tolson, do you have a question, comment? You want to jump in?
A quick observation responding to Emmeline and Sam's earlier question. I mean, I think her question about the power of horoscopes in the ancient world and the parallels with modern day psychometricians is absolutely spot on. And it reminds me of the old Chaldean proverb, allegedly uttered by a Chaldean priest who were the great horoscope makers, is only a fool is governed by his stars. And in a way, I think you could say only a fool today is someone who's governed by his psychometric profile. But it also, I think, brings back Sam's point when he talked about Jason Blakely's book, that social scientists now do not simply describe the world, but they are, in a sense, shaping the reality of our world and the reality, the projected realities of people themselves, which is a scary thought, I think. And again, it is this, it imposes a kind of fatalism that reduces the human all the time, either to your star sign and the traits that are supposedly in here and that, or some sort of psychological personality profile. But thank you, Chris, for the great thoughts about all that.
Chris, do you have any final thoughts or responses that you wanted to express before we call it a day?
Well, as you can see, I have a take on all this, but there's still a lot more to learn. I've been sitting here trying to imagine someone coming from the world of therapy, right, who uses these tests to help people. Like, sort of, they might ask, well, what do you want me to do? Right? Because the use of these tests has entered into the best practices literature. And when that happens, you are, as a professional, beholden to that. Right. And with mental health being such a burden on professionals these days, it's sort of like, well, yeah, I mean, maybe these tests can be a helpful shortcut because after all, someone who's trying to help others does not have the space to form deep, meaningful, vulnerable friendships with them, like, which would be ideal. So if that's an issue, I think I just want to say, look, I'm sympathetic to that situation, but I would suggest this. I would say, use your instrument, but then as soon as it's over, say, ask your patient, ask your client, okay, here are the findings. How do these feel wrong to you? How do these feel wrong to you? What is this? Not how do you identify with this, or what is it, or here are the patterns of behavior that go with this abbreviation, but actually administer the instrument and say, you know what, this is sort of hypothetical and for the most part probably wrong. It doesn't represent who you are, but now we can talk about your reactions to it. Let's listen to your reactions to it as to how it does not fit who you are, and go from there. So use the tests, but make the test usage sort of self-effacing. And I think that would make for an interesting way forward.
Well, because in that scenario, you're centering the human person again, right? You're not centering the instrument, and you're making the sort of elaboration or the understanding of the person that's developing in the form of a conversation, right? Which is, I mean,
Yeah.
it seems to be like in our conversations today, you've been sort of pitting conversation and conversations that occur across time in the form of relationships and a little society in the case of a small or a business, for example, that you're putting that as a sort of alternative to test taking, right?
Yeah, yeah, maybe that's idealistic. I mean, but look, like, even if, what's a good therapist going to tell you? Go and make better friends, right? Right? Not get an app that tells you how to perform your type, right? I mean, that, by the way, is probably already existing, I would imagine. The GPS for your personality conduct. Yeah, I say, yeah, fine. If we must use the tests as a shortcut, then use them. And maybe it's helpful to know. I mean, maybe it is helpful to know. Okay, I tend to have these traits, and I haven't really realized that. But right away, I think it needs to be expressed, even in a corporate context. That, you know what, this test is absolutely not representing who you are. It's
Yeah.
representing some aspect of how we're used to seeing people that wear your persona, right? So let's talk about, instead of dwelling on the recipe for becoming an optimized version of yourself, why don't you tell me about why don't you tell me about yourself more qualitatively?
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. We have just a couple of minutes, and so I did not want to neglect this most recent comment from Ross Basingthwaite, who says the ubiquitous impact of social media on identity plays into this conversation in a huge way, and this needs to be addressed too. Do you have any short thoughts on that? That's a huge topic. I mean, we could have spent an hour and a half or longer talking about that.
Yes, please. It's
Yeah.
absolutely true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially, I think we all know, right? The irony of being more connected and less connected at the same time. I mean, some people, maybe they find meaningful connections through social media, and feel ratified as individuals through those connections. But I suspect, it's better to be done,
Yeah.
less virtually.
Well, we'll end it there. I want to thank you all for being here to this Hedgehog Noontime Discussion. Thank you, Chris, so much for doing this with us. This conversation was just everything that I would hope an event like this would be, and I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us and share your thoughts. It's very thought-provoking and very helpful for me, and I'm sure for many people here. We have an upcoming Hedgehog evening discussion. This is a new time for us on Tuesday, March 19th at 7 p.m. That's Tuesday, March 19th, 7 p.m. I'm going to be joined by Paul Netoliski, who's the assistant director at the Institute here, talking about my new book on the history of corporate power and social responsibility. If you're interested in that event, you can go to iasculture.org. That's iasculture.org, and go to events. And then please go to Hedgehog Review to read Chris's essay if you haven't, and read other essays. Subscribe. Please tell your friends. And thank you all very much. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.